Have you ever imagined entering an abandoned place and discovering that the past is still alive there, waiting to be revealed? It was supposed to be just another cleaning job. Lock the doors, turn off the lights, and leave. But when Marcus Wilson entered that abandoned theater in Detroit and looked at the empty seats, his hands began to tremble. What he saw in that moment would change his life forever and reveal a secret kept for 40 years. Because those seats weren't really empty. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what you're about to discover might surprise you in ways you never imagined. Marcus Wilson was 52 years old and had worked as a contracted janitor for over 2 decades. He was one of those men of few words, with calloused hands and a routine that rarely changed. He would wake up at 5 in the morning, drink his black coffee, and go out to face any challenge that came his way. And let me tell you, there was no shortage of challenges. He had seen it all. Buildings infested with rats the size of cats, corporate offices destroyed by disgruntled employees, abandoned warehouses where the silence was so heavy it seemed to scream. Nothing scared him anymore. Or at least that's what he thought. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling of thinking you've seen it all in life until something completely unexpected catches you by surprise? That's exactly what happened to Marcus on that cold Tuesday morning in October 2019. The phone rang early, and on the other end of the line was the firm voice of the owner of an old building in downtown Detroit. The proposal seemed simple, almost boring: to do one last inspection of an abandoned theater, lock everything up, and hand over the keys. A routine job, quick, easy, or so everyone thought. But there are places that hold more than dust and old furniture. There are places that hold stories, tragedies, secrets that someone tried hard to erase, but that time insists on preserving. And the Palace Theatre was one of those places. What Marcus was about to discover in that silent building would shake not only his life, but an entire city that had chosen to forget a night of terror that happened decades ago. And before I continue with this story that will leave you speechless, I need to ask you something. If you're feeling that chill down your spine, that curiosity that won't let you pause the video, then leave a like now. Seriously, this isn't just an automatic request. When you like this video, you help me bring this story to many more people, to people who also need to know what Marcus discovered in that theater. And look, I know this topic resonates with you, so leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Would you also have the courage to enter an abandoned place like that alone? Or have you ever been in a situation where you discovered something that completely changed your perspective on a place or a story? Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Every comment, every like, every subscriber represents a community that values real stories, stories that need to be told. So if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button now and activate the bell, because every week I bring you stories like this that make you reflect, feel, and see the world in a different way. These are the stories that no one forgets, and you deserve to be part of this journey with me. Now, let's go back to Detroit, to that cold October morning, and discover what awaited Marcus inside the Palace Theatre. Because what happened next will make you question how many secrets are hidden within the walls of old buildings all around us. The property owner was direct on the phone, without beating around the bush, with the tone of someone who had already made all the decisions and just needed someone to execute the plan. "Marcus, I need you to go to the Palace Theatre on Woodward Avenue. We're going to demolish the building next week. I just need you to do one last inspection, lock everything up, and hand me the keys. Simple as that." Simple? Marcus felt a pang in his chest when he heard the name of that place. Simple was the last word he would use to describe anything related to the Palace Theatre. He knew that theatre. In fact, everyone in Detroit knew it. It wasn't one of those abandoned buildings that go unnoticed in the urban landscape. No, the Palace had history. It had soul. And it had mystery. In the 1970s and 80s, the Palace Theatre was the cultural center of Detroit, a true temple of art and entertainment. It was the kind of place you saw in classic movies, with its imposing facade, luminous signs, and an entrance hall that looked more like a European palace. Hollywood stars walked that red carpet, Famous singers performed sold-out shows in a matter of hours. Broadway plays were staged there before they even reached New York. The Palace wasn't just a theater, it was a symbol of glamour, of cultural transformation, of an era when Detroit still shone as one of the great American metropolises. People dressed in their best clothes just to enter that place. It was an experience, a journey to another dimension of elegance and sophistication. But in 1983, something happened, and here begins the real mystery that no one has been able to unravel for almost 4 decades. The theater closed overnight, without explanation, without prior notice, without the farewell ceremony that iconic places usually have. The doors were locked and never opened again. Just like that, employees arrived for work the next morning and found chains on the doors. The public, who had purchased tickets for the coming weeks, received refunds without any justification. The newspapers of the time published short, vague notes, almost as if they were afraid to say more than they should. "Palace Theatre closes indefinitely," the headlines read. But why? No one explained. No one questioned it publicly. It was as if the whole city had made a silent pact to simply accept it and move on. For 36 years, the palace stood there, untouched, like a time capsule in the heart of a Detroit that was changing around it. The city faced economic crises, industrial decline, profound transformations in its mentality and identity. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned and reborn. But the palace remained exactly as it was on that last night of March 1983. People passed by it every day, glanced at it, felt an inexplicable chill and went on their way. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors about places like that. Some said the theater was haunted. Others spoke of financial problems that were never disclosed. There were those who whispered about something terrible that had happened backstage, something that needed to be buried, along with the reputation of the place. But none of this was confirmed. They were just fragments of stories, pieces of hidden truth that no one dared to piece together. And now Marcus was there, holding the phone, listening to the news that in a week that place would be demolished. All the answers that might have been inside would be turned to dust and rubble. When Marcus parked in front of the palace that afternoon, a shiver ran down his spine, and it wasn't because of the cold October wind that cut through the streets of Detroit. It was something different, something that came from within, a visceral feeling that his body recognized even before his mind could process it. The building was imposing, even in ruins, even covered by decades of neglect. You could feel the grandeur that place once had. The Art Deco facade still retained traces of its former glory, with its elegant arches, geometric details, and lines that told the story of an era when architecture was an art form. But now it was covered in graffiti, accumulated dirt, broken glass, and a thick layer of neglect that seemed to silently scream about all that had been lost. Marcus stood there for a moment, just observing. He'd done this kind of work hundreds of times, but something about this place was different. There was a heavy energy, an almost tangible presence that made the surrounding air seem denser. He took a deep breath, picked up the bunch of rusty keys the landlady had given him, and walked to the main entrance. Each step on the cracked concrete echoed strangely, as if the ground itself were announcing his arrival. The chains that held the doors, locked, were covered in orange rust, silent witnesses to all those years of isolation. Marcus chose the larger key, turned it with effort in the old lock, and finally the door gave way. The creak that followed was chilling. The door didn't just creak, it screamed, as if protesting after decades of forced silence, as if warning that some places should not be disturbed. Inside, the darkness was almost total, a darkness that seemed to have a substance of its own, that seemed to swallow the light before it, could even fully penetrate. Marcus turned on his powerful flashlight, and the beam of light cut through the entrance hall like a blade. Dust danced in the air in slow, almost hypnotic movements, illuminated by the beam of light. Suspended particles that had not been disturbed for decades now moved for the first time in years. The smell was of mold, old wood, decaying fabric, and something else. Something he couldn't identify, but which triggered a primal alarm in his brain. It was a smell of Time standing still of trapped memories, of stories that were never told. The entrance hall still retained vestiges of its former elegance. The marble floor, though covered in dirt and cracks, still displayed intricate patterns. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like skeletons of something that had once been brilliant, and there on the walls, covered in peeling wallpaper, faded posters still hung in crooked frames. Marcus held the flashlight close to one of them. The colors had faded. Almost completely, but the lettering was still legible. The Last Dance, March 15, 1983. Marcus felt a weight on his chest, a pressure that wasn't physical but emotional. That date meant something. That was the last time that place had seen life. It was the end of a story that no one had fully told. He walked further inside, his flashlight revealing disturbing details. There was a popcorn cart overturned on the floor, fossilized popcorn scattered around like confetti from a party that ended. Abruptly, there were programs from the last performance strewn across the floor, as if people had dropped them in their haste to leave. Something was profoundly wrong there. Marcus had enough experience to recognize when a place had been abandoned intentionally, and when it had been abandoned in panic. And the Palace Theatre screamed panic in every detail, every object out of place, every half-open door, every sign of a hurried exit, told a story that no one had dared to investigate. The transformation of that place from a cultural temple to a silent tomb had not been natural. It had been forced. It had been a decision made by someone who wanted to bury not just a building, but a truth. Subscribe to the channel now, because what Marcus is about to discover will make you question how many stories around us have been deliberately erased, how many truths have been buried under layers of silence. You are part of this journey of revelation, and what comes next will show you that the backstage of abandoned places sometimes holds more than just memories. It holds evidence of something someone didn't want to be found. And Marcus was about to cross the threshold, separating mystery from complete revelation. Marcus walked down the main corridor, his footsteps echoing in the void in a way that made each sound seem amplified, multiplied, as if there were 1,000 Marcuses walking simultaneously in parallel dimensions. The echo wasn't just physical, it was almost ghostly, carrying with it the weight of all the people who had ever passed through there, all the laughter, all the lively conversations before a show, all the expectations that had once filled that space. Each door he opened revealed more of the frozen past, more pieces of a life that had been abruptly interrupted. There were ticket booths with tickets still in the drawers, some already printed with dates that never happened, dreams of performances that would never come. There were employee uniforms hanging on, rusty hooks, name tags with the names of people who had probably already moved on with their lives, forgetting or trying to forget that place. There was a popcorn cart overturned on the floor, as if someone had knocked it over in their haste. There were programs scattered along the corridor as if people had run away, leaving everything behind, prioritizing only one thing: escape. Every detail was a clue, every object out of place was evidence that something extraordinary and terrible had happened. Marcus wasn't a detective, but his experience cleaning dozens of abandoned buildings had taught him to read spaces like others read books, and that space was screaming a story of chaos, of fear, of split-second decisions when survival becomes the only priority. The mindset of someone who abandons a place intentionally is completely different from the mindset of someone who flees. And there, in that corridor, it was clear that people had fled. But it was when he reached the double doors of the main auditorium that his heart began to pound, hammering against his ribs with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. Two monumental doors of solid mahogany with bronze details forming Art Deco patterns of elegant geometric lines. Even covered in dust, they still radiated a silent dignity, like guardians of a sacred temple. Marcus placed his hands on the cold wood and felt a strange vibration, as if the building itself were breathing on the other side. He pushed slowly, and the doors opened with a deep, resonant groan that reverberated throughout the theatre. The auditorium revealed itself before him like a forgotten cathedral, a sanctuary of time that had decided to stand still. Marcus stood paralyzed at the entrance, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hands. There were 1,200 red velvet armchairs arranged in perfect rows, like soldiers in eternal formation. Even faded and covered in decades of dust, they still retained a majestic dignity. A gigantic chandelier hung from the ceiling, with hundreds of crystals that once reflected light and joy, now hung like a forgotten jewel in a dark cave. And the stage, my God, the stage still had the set of a play set up. A living room from the 80s, complete and intact. There was a floral sofa, a coffee table with magazines, a beige landline phone, pictures on the false walls. It was like looking through a window of time, as if at any moment the actors would appear and continue the performance that had been interrupted. Almost 4 decades ago. Marcus walked down the central aisle, his steps sinking into the dusty red carpet. His flashlight illuminated every detail with almost surgical precision. He could see the seat numbers still legible on small bronze plaques. He could see the heavy, majestic side curtains of the stage, still hanging from their rods. He could see the dust dancing in the air like snow in slow motion. And then, when he was halfway to the front of the auditorium, something caught his attention. Something that made his blood run cold and his breath catch. Something that would completely transform his understanding of what had happened there. Because those seats, those 200 seats that should have been completely empty after 36 years of neglect, were not as empty as they should have been. What Marcus found in those armchairs will change everything you thought you knew about this story. There was something on the seats. Not all of them, but scattered throughout the theatre, like marks left by ghosts of a night no one wanted to remember. Marcus focused the flashlight's beam and his stomach churned. Personal belongings, things people carry with them, intimate things, things you don't abandon unless something very serious is happening. A black bag in row C still open, its contents partially spilled onto the seat next to it. A men's wool coat thrown over seat 12, as if the owner had taken it off to get more comfortable and then never returned to retrieve it. Reading. Glasses carefully placed on the arm of a seat, in the exact position someone would leave them when standing up quickly. A high-heeled shoe lying on the aisle floor, alone, the pair lost somewhere, telling the story of someone who ran so desperately that they lost the shoe along the way. And there was more. Much more. Programs of the show opened to the cast pages, as if someone were reading about the actors while waiting for the show to begin. An overturned coffee cup on the floor, the dark brown, stained dried decades ago, forming a ghostly halo on the red carpet. There was a folded silk scarf on a seat. There was an open cigarette pack with 3 cigarettes still inside. There was even a child's toy, a small brown teddy bear sitting alone in a back row seat, waiting for a child who never came back to claim it. But what made Marcus freeze completely, what made every hair on his body stand on end and his breath catch in his throat, was the pattern. It wasn't one object here, another there, randomly placed. It was a pattern. The objects were positioned in a very specific way, in a way that told a clear story to anyone who knew how to read the signs. People hadn't left calmly. They hadn't finished watching the spectacle, gathered their belongings, and left in an orderly fashion. No, they had simply disappeared from the object's point of view, got up and ran, leaving absolutely everything behind, bags with money and documents, expensive coats, glasses that many people can't see. Without shoes. Even a baby would be forced to leave without their favorite teddy bear. This wasn't a planned evacuation. This was pure panic. Marcus felt his hands tremble as the flashlight moved from one object to another, illuminating each piece of this hidden truth that was being revealed before his eyes. How many people were here on that last night of March 15th, 1983? The theatre had a capacity of 1,200 people, and judging by the scattered objects, it seemed packed. How many of those people left carrying a trauma they could never talk about? And why did they leave in such a hurry? What had happened on that stage, in that 1980s living room set that was still in place, that made more than 1,000 people abandon everything and rush for the exits? Marcus's mindset was rapidly shifting. He'd walked in thinking it was just another cleaning job, another abandoned building with its usual share of old furniture and dust. But now he was in the middle of an unsolved crime scene, a tragedy. that had been swept under the rug for almost 4 decades. He took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in his hands, and decided to investigate more closely. He needed to understand. He needed to know what had happened to all those people. Because something inside him, some force he couldn't explain, told him that this story needed to be told. Those people who left their belongings behind deserved for someone to finally discover the truth. Marcus began walking between the rows, examining each object more closely, searching for clues, for anything that could explain the inexplicable. And it was when he approached the stage, when his flashlight illuminated the wooden floor where the actors should have performed that last night, that he saw something that almost made his heart stop. Subscribe to the channel, because what Marcus is about to discover goes beyond abandoned objects. The impact of this journey behind the scenes of a night that changed hundreds of lives is only beginning to unfold, and you need to see where this trail of evidence will lead. Marcus began to gather some of the objects, his hands still trembling slightly, but now moved by a determination he didn't know he possessed. Trying to understand, trying to piece together the puzzle of a night that had been erased from official records, he picked up the black bag from row C and carefully opened it, as if opening a time capsule. Inside was a brown leather wallet, worn from use, with that characteristic smell of old leather mixed with women's perfume that had lingered for decades. He opened the wallet, and there, protected by a yellowish plastic, was an identification. Sarah Mitchell, born in 1957. The photo showed a smiling woman of about 25 or 26 years old, wavy brown hair in the typical 80s style, bright eyes full of life and expectation. Sarah had come to the theater that night, probably expecting a pleasant evening of entertainment. She didn't know she would leave her bag behind, and that her life would be forever marked by what was about to happen. Marcus carefully put away his wallet, feeling the weight of the responsibility of holding a piece of someone's life. He picked up the open program from one of the armchairs, its pages yellowed and brittle to the touch. "The Last Dance, a Story of Love and Loss," read the headline in elegant lettering. What a cruel irony, Marcus thought. A story of love and loss that had become literal in a way no one could have predicted. The date printed in smaller letters on the cover, March 15, 1983, the same date as the poster at the entrance, the last performance. And now Marcus understood why it had truly been the last. He leafed through the show and saw the cast names, the act summaries, the acknowledgements to the sponsors. Everything seemed so normal, so ordinary, so distant from the tragedy that was about to unfold. But it was when Marcus finally mustered the courage to step onto the stage, when his feet touched those wooden boards where actors had performed their final lines, that his blood truly ran cold. Because there, under the dim, flickering light of his flashlight, revealing itself little by little like secrets reluctant to emerge from the darkness, he saw something that shouldn't be there, something that completely transformed the nature of that investigation. There were marks on the stage floor, dark, irregular marks, scattered in a pattern that told a story of violence and despair. Stains that looked like they had been hastily cleaned, frantically rubbed by someone who wanted to erase the evidence, but not completely removed. The wood had absorbed the liquid, creating permanent stains that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. Marcus was experienced. He had spent over 20 years cleaning buildings. He had seen all kinds of dirt, all kinds of stains, all kinds of evidence of things that happen when no one is looking. He knew how to recognize that kind of stain. He had seen it before in other scenes, in other places where violence had left its indelible mark. It was blood, human blood that had been spilled there on that stage almost 40 years ago, and that no one had been able to completely erase, no matter how hard they tried. The transformation in Marcus's understanding was instantaneous and devastating. This was not just an abandoned theater. This was not just a place that had closed for financial or structural reasons. This was the site of a crime. This was the scene of a tragedy that had been hidden, covered up, swept under the rug by people with enough power to make an entire city forget. Marcus knelt beside one of the larger stains, bringing the flashlight closer. His training and experience told him exactly what he was seeing. The pattern of splatter, the concentration of the stain, the way it had spread. Someone had been seriously injured there, perhaps mortally, and then all the pieces began to fall into place in Marcus's mind. Like a macabre jigsaw puzzle finally revealing its complete picture. The people running and leaving everything behind, the theatre closing overnight, the absolute silence that surrounded the closure for 36 years. It wasn't just an accident that had been hidden. It was something much bigger, much darker, something that involved decisions made in halls of power, something that required the silence of hundreds of witnesses. His heart pounding, beating so hard Marcus could feel the pulse in his temples. He was now completely on stage, stepping on the same spots where actors had given their last performances and where something terrible had happened. His most basic survival instincts told him to leave immediately, call the police, do anything but continue exploring that place alone. All his 2 decades of experience in abandoned buildings screamed that he was crossing a dangerous line, that he was stirring up something powerful people had tried so hard to bury. But something stronger pulled him, a force he couldn't resist, the deep, visceral need to understand what had happened there, to give voice to the people who had been silenced, to honor Sarah Mitchell and all the other people who left their lives scattered in those seats. He walked backstage past the heavy side curtains that still hung from their rods, across the space where the actors waited their turn to go on stage. It was even more chaotic there than in the main auditorium. Electrical cables hung from the ceiling, like vines in an abandoned jungle, some still connected to rusty spotlights that would never again illuminate a stage. Scenery was precariously piled against the walls, paintings of house facades, fake trees, pieces of fictional worlds that would never be built again. Costumes hung on rusty racks, period dresses covered in mold, men's suits with fossilized moths in the pockets, everything preserved in a state of slow decay, as if time itself had decided to document the decay. And then he saw something that made his heart race even faster. A door at the back of the backstage area, half hidden behind a heavy black velvet curtain that someone had deliberately positioned to conceal the entrance. The door was different from the others, more robust, older, made of metal painted grey, and it had a handwritten notice in thick, irregular letters, the kind of urgent handwriting of someone under pressure, now faded, but still legible. Authorized personnel only. Marcus felt a chill. Doors with notices like that always hold secrets. They always hide things that someone doesn't want to be found. Marcus pushed the door. Locked, of course. He searched through the bunch of rusty keys the landlady had given him, trying them one by one, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and anticipation. Most didn't fit until he found a small old one, with jagged teeth and a patina of rust that indicated decades of disuse. It slid into the lock with some resistance, but fit perfectly. Marcus turned it and heard the satisfying click of the mechanism giving way. The door opened with a metallic groan, revealing a darkness even deeper than that of the theatre, a staircase leading down, a basement, a place where secrets go to be buried. Marcus's flashlight illuminated the dust-covered steps, each revealing ancient footprints blurred by time, evidence that others had descended there before him, probably in a hurry to hide what could not be seen. He descended slowly, each step echoing on. The narrow staircase, each rung seeming like an echo of decisions he could not undo. He was crossing a threshold. Once he saw what was down there, once he knew the whole truth, there would be no way he could not know. There would be no going back, and simply locking up the theatre and handing over the keys as if nothing had happened. The transformation of his journey from ordinary caretaker to guardian of an explosive truth was complete. Down below, in the damp and claustrophobic basement, he found a small office. There was a rusty metal desk, an overturned chair, old files stacked on the shelves, and there on the desk, as if it had been waiting for him all these years, as if fate had orchestrated that exact moment, was a faded but still intact cardboard box. And on top, written in red letters that time had not been able to completely erase, was the word confidential. Subscribe to the channel because what's inside that box will reveal a conspiracy involving powerful people, impossible decisions, and a truth that changed the lives of hundreds of people forever. Inside the box, Marcus found files, dozens of them, organized in manila folders that had seen better days, with elastic bands that crumbled at the touch. Police reports with official stamps from the Detroit Police Department, witness statements typed on old typewriters, some with handwritten corrections, others with stains that looked like tears dried decades ago. Black and white photos documenting a crime, scene that should never have been forgotten. Yellowed newspaper clippings, fragile as autumn leaves, some with headlines that said very little but hinted at so much. And there, in that damp and forgotten basement, spread out on that rusty table, under the flickering light of his flashlight, was all the truth that had been buried for 36 years. Marcus began to read, his hands trembling, each word revealing a deeper layer of horror and sorrow. On the night of March 15th, 1983, during the final performance of The Last Dance, something terrible happened, something that would forever change the lives of everyone present. The lead actor, Vincent Caruso, a man known in Detroit theater circles for his undeniable talent, but also for his volatile and explosive temper, for his documented history of domestic violence that had been minimized and ignored by the entertainment industry at the time, collapsed on stage. But it wasn't a simple nervous or artistic breakdown. It wasn't an actor forgetting his lines or leaving the stage. It was something much, much worse. The witnesses, in their statements which Marcus read with growing horror, described a scene of pure terror that began subtly and exploded into violence in a matter of seconds. Vincent was in the middle of an emotional scene in the second act, a heated argument with the main character played by Rebecca Moore. It was a scene of marital confrontation, of a marriage disintegrating, of bitter words being exchanged. And then, without warning, without any sign that he was going off script, Vincent pulled out a gun, a real gun, not a theatrical prop, a .38 caliber revolver that he had hidden in his costume, and he threatened the cast. The audience, composed of 200 people who had come for a pleasant evening at the theater, initially thought it was part of the performance. Some people even applauded the intensity of the performance, until they heard the first shot. The sound echoed through the auditorium like thunder in an enclosed space, deafening, unmistakable. The shot struck the lead actress Rebecca Moore in the chest. Rebecca, who was not only his scene partner, but his ex-wife in real life. The woman who had divorced him 2 years earlier because of the constant abuse, threats, and psychological and physical violence she had endured for years. The woman who had had the courage to rebuild her life and career away from him, who had become a star in her own right, who was finally free. Until that night. Rebecca fell on stage, blood staining her white period dress while the light still shone on her, and it was at that moment that the audience understood. This was not theater. It was real. Panic set in instantly, like a wave engulfing everything in its path. The 200 people in the theater simultaneously rushed for the exits in utter despair, trampling each other, screaming, leaving absolutely everything behind. Bags with precious belongings, expensive coats, shoes, children, clutching teddy bears. Nothing mattered except escaping that place where the line between fiction and reality had been crossed in the most brutal way possible. Vincent tried to fire again, but the gun jammed. He was restrained backstage by members of the technical crew who had the courage to confront him, men who risked their lives to prevent further bloodshed. Rebecca was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance that arrived minutes later, with paramedics working desperately to stop the bleeding. But she succumbed to her injuries. Rebecca Moore, 28, a talented actress with a brilliant career ahead of her, was pronounced dead at 11:47 p.m. that night. But here was the real shock, the part of the story that transformed the horror of that night into something even more sinister and disturbing. The story was never made public. Marcus read the documents with growing disbelief, his hands trembling no longer from fear, but from profound indignation. The family that owned the theater, the Thorntons, one of Detroit's most powerful and influential dynasties at the time, with tentacles extending into politics, the media, business, and the judicial system, completely suppressed the case. And when I say completely, I mean they orchestrated one of the biggest cover-up operations the city had ever seen. They paid witnesses to remain silent, offering obscene sums of money in exchange for eternal silence. They bribed high-ranking police officers, ensuring that official reports never saw the light of day. That evidence was filed away in boxes marked confidential and forgotten in basements like this one. They used all their political influence, making calls to judges, prosecutors, journalists, anyone who could make this story disappear as if it had never happened. The motive behind this massive conspiracy was as banal as it was revolting: to protect the legacy of the Palace Theatre and avoid a scandal that would destroy not only the reputation of that specific place, but the entire entertainment empire that the Thornton family had built over decades. For them, Rebecca Moore was merely collateral damage, an inconvenient victim whose death could be managed, controlled, transformed into something other than what it actually was. It was a matter of business, a cold and calculated decision about protecting investments and maintaining appearances. The mentality of these people was frightening in its coldness. They saw the tragedy not as a crime that demanded justice, but as a public relations problem that needed to be resolved as efficiently as possible. Vincent Caruso, the killer who had taken Rebecca's life in front of more than 1,000 witnesses, was quietly committed to an expensive private psychiatric institution in rural Michigan, far from any public attention. He never faced trial. He was never formally charged with murder. Documents showed that he died 2 years later, in 1985, officially of natural causes, although there were hints in medical reports that it might have been suicide. Rebecca Moore, the victim, the talented and courageous woman who had tried to rebuild her life away from her abuser, was buried with the completely fabricated official story of a domestic accident. Her newspaper obituary mentioned a tragic fall at her home. There was no mention of the Palace Theatre, no mention of Vincent, no truth whatsoever. The witnesses, all 200 people who had seen the horror unfold before their eyes, were systematically pressured into signing confidentiality agreements under legal and financial threats. Some received money. Others were threatened with lawsuits that would destroy their lives. All were made to understand that speaking about what they saw would have serious consequences. And it worked. For 36 years, more than 1,000 people carried this secret, this shared trauma that they could never publicly process, that they could never discuss with therapists or loved ones without violating legal agreements that could ruin them. The psychological impact of this is immeasurable, and the theatre simply closed, locked, forgotten, as if it could be erased from collective memory in the same way the Thorntons erased the truth from official records. For 36 years, that place held the secret of a tragedy that was never acknowledged, that never received the attention and mourning it deserved. The seats still held the belongings of the people who ran for their lives that night, objects that became involuntary relics of a silenced collective trauma. Marcus sat on the cold basement floor, his legs simply giving way under the emotional weight of what he had discovered. He held the documents against his chest, feeling the old, fragile paper against his fingers. Tears streamed freely down his face, tears of sadness, of anger, of helplessness in the face of so much injustice. He thought of Sarah Mitchell, the owner of that wallet with the smiling photo. Where was she now? How had she lived all these years carrying that memory without being able to talk about it? He thought of all those people who lived through that trauma and were forced into silence, who had to pretend that night never happened while Rebecca Moore was buried under lies. Subscribe to the channel because you need to see how Marcus transformed this devastating discovery into action, how he decided that that silence of almost 4 decades finally needed to be broken. Marcus didn't lock up the theatre that day. He climbed up from the basement, clutching the box of documents as if carrying the weight of 1,000 souls who had waited decades for justice. He left the Palace Theatre with a determination he had never felt before in his life. He called the property owner from the parking lot, his hands still trembling, and told her clearly and directly that he couldn't do the job. Not the way she expected. He wasn't going to lock those doors and hand over the keys as if nothing had happened. Not after what he had discovered. The owner tried to argue, talking about contracts and demolition deadlines, but Marcus was firm. There was something much bigger at stake than simple bureaucratic procedures. So he called an investigative journalist he trusted, a man named David Chen, who worked for the Detroit Free Press and had a reputation for not being afraid to expose inconvenient truths, no matter who was involved. In the following weeks, the story of the Palace Theatre finally came to light in a way that no one in Detroit could ignore. The documents Marcus found in that basement were meticulously verified, digitized and published. Headlines exploded in all the local and then national newspapers. Detroit Theatre hid murder for 36 years. Powerful family covered up crime in historic theatre. More than 1,000 witnesses silenced for decades. It was a scandal that shook not only the city, but the entire country. Survivors of that night, now elderly in their 60s and 70s, were finally able to speak publicly for the first time in 4 decades. They wept in televised interviews, describing the trauma they had carried alone for so long, the guilt of having been forced into silence while Rebecca Moore was buried under lies. Sarah Mitchell, the woman in the photo in the wallet, was still alive. She gave a moving interview where she said she had returned to the theatre in her nightmares every night for the past 36 years, and that finally, she could begin to process that trauma openly. Rebecca Moore received the fitting memorial she always deserved. Her family, who never had real answers about her death, who had been forced to accept the absurd story of a domestic accident, even knowing something terribly wrong, finally found closure. Her younger sister, now a 55-year-old woman, organized a beautiful ceremony at the Palace Theatre, where hundreds of people attended to honor Rebecca's memory. She spoke of the sister she knew, the courageous woman who had chosen to rebuild her life away from an abuser, the talented artist whose potential was brutally cut short. It was a moment of collective mourning that the city desperately needed. The Palace Theatre was not demolished. The transformation of that place from a silent tomb into a symbol of truth and justice was profound and significant. After months of negotiations involving the city, non-profit organizations, and survivors of that night, the building was transformed into a memorial and awareness center about domestic violence and abuse of power. The seats were preserved exactly as Marcus found them, with personal belongings still in the places where they were left that night in March 1983. It is a physical and visceral reminder that some secrets require light, not silence, that the truth has a transformative power that no conspiracy can suppress forever. Marcus Wilson became a volunteer curator of the memorial, dedicating the rest of his life to honoring the memory of Rebecca Moore and all those who were silenced. To this day, he guides visitors through the theatre several times a week, telling the complete story without omitting any detail, showing the bloodstains that are still on the stage, the objects in the seats, the documents from the basement that are now on protected display. He tells everyone who approaches him that that day changed his life, that he now understands that his purpose was not just to clean buildings, but to reveal truths. Because sometimes a cleaner's job isn't just about locking doors and turning off lights. Sometimes it's about bringing the truth to light, about having the courage not to look the other way when you discover something the world needs to know. And if you've made it this far with me on this incredible journey through the story of Marcus Wilson and the Palace Theatre, I want to truly thank you. Not everyone has the patience and genuine interest to follow a story from beginning to end, especially one as profound and moving as this one. And look, if this content touched you in any way, if it made you reflect on courage, truth, or how small decisions can change entire lives, leave a like below. This shows me that this type of story resonates with you and motivates me to continue bringing you content like this. And you know what I like most? Reading the comments from those who actually watched until the end. So leave the phrase, "The truth always comes to light," in the comments below. That way I know you're with me from beginning to end, and I can reply. Personally, I love exchanging ideas with you about these stories. Tell me also, would you have had the courage that Marcus had? Or would you have simply locked the doors and moved on with your life? If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you real stories that move us, that make us think and feel. They are stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, stories that deserve to be told and remembered. And look, there's a video right here that you need to watch. It's about another unbelievable discovery that changed everything for those who had the courage to investigate. Click and continue watching. I'm sure you'll enjoy it as much as you enjoyed this story. See you in the next video. And always remember, never underestimate the power of a person who refuses to remain silent.